السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Continuing from last night, I said that the stories of the Holy Quran are the story of the soul, and these stories have to be taken very seriously and not just as a narrative in history. And one of the stories which inshallah I'll be speaking about, and I'll be reading from the book Futuhat, is the narrative between Nabi Musa alayhi salam and the Pharaoh. And as I said, this has many different dimensions to it. We'll go through it very slowly, inshallah, and we'll cover the different dimensions that the Urafa in particular have paid attention to. The author of Futuhat, Ibn Arabi, I'll just read 2 or 3 sentences every night and then go into it in some detail. فأمر باللين بالجبابرة الطغاة فقيل لنا فقولا له قولا لينا وما يؤمر بلين المقال إلا من قوته أعظم من قوة من أرسل إليه وبطشه أشد لكنه لما علم الحق أنه قد طبع على قلب مظهر للجبروت والكبرياء وأنه في نفسه أذل الأذلاء أمر أن يؤامل بالرحمة واللين لمناسبة باطنه. Says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered and commanded smoothness, gentleness towards the tyrant oppressor. And Allah ordered Nabi Musa, commanded him to be gentle towards Pharaoh, who was a tyrant, a corrupt one. And it is said to us in the Holy Quran, فَقُولَا, you two say, referring to Nabi Musa and Nabi Harun alayhim as-salam, you two say, lahu, to Pharaoh, قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا, you speak to Pharaoh a gentle speaking. This قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا, gentle word, gentle speaking, this is very important. And this in itself has a lot of connotations that come with it. And the Urafa have grasped onto those connotations. You can't just quickly pass by these very delicate wording of the Holy Quran. And then he says that only those people who are of greater strength and have greater force, only these people are commanded to propagate with a gentle voice, not other people. You have to be someone who is أعظم من قوة, and أشد بطشة, i.e. they are power-wise, force-wise, these people have to be stronger than the people who they want to, or they're sent towards. If one has that strength and force, only then Allah will say, go and speak with them a gentle speech, a gentle word. But if they're not stronger, if they're not more forceful, no, the command would not come. All these have connotations with it. I just want to go through it step by step. Musa alayhi salam has to be much stronger, not only in faith-wise, as a person. He must have more force, more strength. And only then he would be commanded to approach the Pharaoh of all people in a gentle manner and with a gentle voice. But if that strength isn't there, if that predominance of force isn't there, speaking with a gentle voice has no meaning. It'll have no effect. This is Amr bil Ma'ruf here. Amr bil Ma'ruf, there has to be some effect for this to happen. If he doesn't have that upper hand in power, in force, he wouldn't have been commanded to speak in a gentle voice. Nabi Musa could have shouted to the Pharaoh. It may have been justified too. If he had shouted out, if he had used force in many other ways. But the command came, for someone like you, I want you to go to the Pharaoh and speak with him a gentle speaking. Now, then he says that Allah knows and knew that whoever is locked in or drowned in arrogance, they will be veiled from Allah. It's a cause and effect relationship in spirituality. You become arrogant, you become veiled from Allah. But Allah also knew that Pharaoh was one of the most destitute of the destitute. Destitute means a kind of humility. Oh, this is where it gets a bit difficult now. I'm not saying what the author of this book is saying is 100% right. I didn't want to give you that idea. But over the next few nights, these things you have to hear at least once in your life. And the main emphasis why I'm stressing for you to at least listen to this side, because it will have some practical benefits for you on your day-to-day living, inshallah. He said, so Allah knew that one who is arrogant, they're veiled from Allah. On the other side, Allah also knew that Pharaoh was one of the destitute people. He was the dhalil. And knowing these two, Umar, the two prophets, were commanded ayyu'amala, to encounter the Pharaoh, given those 2 points, that one who's arrogant, which the Pharaoh was on the outside. The second point, and one who's destitute, humble, a kind of form of humility, which Pharaoh was on the inside. You may think this is very peculiar, but maybe many, even tyrants that we've seen in our time. I don't want to go into names, because once you enter particularities, once someone commented and said to me that never enter particularities because the examples you give always does more damage than benefit. So I take that, to heart a bit. But many of the tyrants, even today, those who are still in power or those who have been removed from power, maybe in their own silence there was a belief in Allah. There was a kind of destitution, but power never allowed that to come to the front. It was power which made them slowly drown into the worldly life and their arrogance factor predominated over that inner destitution. But if they were propagated by a prophetic figure, if they had access to a prophetic holy figure, maybe things would have been different. We don't know. But we can't put them all in one basket. Many Urafa even think that the story of Pharaoh is the story of the self in this way, that Pharaoh was arrogant, but he disclosed his arrogance without hiding it. Whereas many of us are arrogant, even in our inside, but we don't disclose it because we're embarrassed, or we think our worldly benefits may be compromised. And then they ask the question, which one is worse? One should never be complacent. We may be even more Pharaoh-like than the Pharaoh. Maybe if we had that control which he had, we would have been much worse. But the point is that we are pathetic individuals with no access, that potential access to do good things aren't even there for us in the first place. But if it were, and we would have entered it, we may have become even worse. That's why most politicians, for example, once the door opens up for them, where they can do a lot of good things, most of them fall. We don't have many successful ones. So it's very easy for us to curse and say things against certain individuals and figures in history, and that's okay. But be careful you're not cursing yourself when you're cursing others. And what I mean by that, inshallah, we'll speak about later. It's a verse in the Holy Quran where it highlights this, where these slogans that people give, it will return to themselves or their offspring in the future, and one has to be careful before they give it. So Pharaoh, yes, he had this outer aspect which was arrogance. He had this inner aspect, according to Ibn Arabi, which was destitution. How was this going to weigh out against one another? Allah said, "O Musa, you go to him. You speak with him. Only you can, but do it in a gentle manner." Let's just take a break here. When you go in the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, in Bihar al-Anwar, there are many traditions which describe the Pharaoh. There are many stories which highlight certain aspects of the Pharaoh. The author of Futuhat, he only focuses on the Quran alone in this one page which I want to read to you in the next few minutes. It's a very focused, analytical study of the actual verses of the Quran. But it's okay for us now to bring traditions that we have from the Ahlul Bayt to just to give it a bit of seasoning. There are 4 attributes which the Pharaoh had according to the Ahlul Bayt. One was that 4 positive attributes. One was that at the front entrance to his palace, he had stuck the signpost, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He had that. Yes, he would say, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la. I am your Lord Almighty, Most High. That was on the outside. Many people, me and you, it may be on our inside. We may behave with people if we had that access and control, as if we were the Rab. Calling oneself Rab is a relative term, but he knew that he wasn't the Rab, the absolute Rab. He knew that. He had Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the tradition it speaks of in his silence at night on the sajjada he would weep before Allah. But power is power. It changes people. They can't just let go. We see this in Karbala too. And we see it today. What happens in people's silence in their private, we don't know. It's just that how that private and that public life, how they encounter with one another and what the final result is, that one doesn't know how one's fate will end. That was one attribute. He knew who was Rab. It was never a question of him denying that. But he was arrogant and he was benefiting from that too. Allah sent prophets to him, 2 prophets to him, in order to guide him. And what was the fate of Pharaoh at the end? We'll come to it. Here the Warafo have another understanding of the fate of Pharaoh. It's quite at odds with what the theologians say. Another attribute was he would feed thousands of people every day. Every day. Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam had said that 400 years was added onto his life because of this attribute. Yes, he would feed a lot. There are some deeds in Islam that when you do, deeds of virtue, that according to Islam, when you do these deeds of virtue, you will receive nothing but virtue in this world and possibly in the hereafter. Hal jaza'ul ihsan illa al-ihsan. It's a Quranic formula. Isn't the compensation of virtue, of beneficence, it can't be anything but beneficence. And on this verse, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, Jalat fil kafir wal mu'min wal barri wal fajir. This verse, that only beneficence is given as a compensation to beneficence. He says this applies to the Muslim, to the kafir, to the good doer and to the corrupt one. Even if you're a corrupt kafir and you do certain deeds, there are benefits. It's a cause and effect relationship. He fed longevity in relation to his life was granted to him. There are many of these actions. Silatul Rahim is another one. Crying for Imam Hussein alayhi salam is another one. Be you Muslim or non-Muslim, you will receive benefits. Simulating the perfect human is another one. You simulate the perfect human, even if you're a non-Muslim, by simulating the perfect human, by simulating the prophets, by simulating the imams, you will derive benefit by doing so. And we'll come with some examples later. And that was another of his good deeds. Another of his good deeds was he was extra protective in relation to his wife. It's not good to, be extra protective or in a burdensome way. But he would isolate his wife and not let anyone have any access to even potentially disrespect his wife. Yet kept them in a place where they had everything they wanted and no one could disrespect them in any possible way. No non-muharram had access to them. This in itself is also a virtue, but it's relative, as I say. I don't want to. Yes. And finally, he was sahlul hijab, the Pharaoh, meaning that whoever wanted to see him, it was extremely easy to see him. There's no appointments, come back next week, 2 weeks' time, 6 months' time. No. And this is a good attribute. This is one of the attributes of Allah. Because you have access to Allah 24/7. The more you are at ease with the people and you allow them to see you, it's more a godly attribute you're acquiring. He had this. Now, I'm a nobody, but many scholars in Rome, in Najaf, true scholars, yes, where you see that they may have breakfast with certain individuals because those individuals have a certain socio-economic standing. But when it comes to the common people, no. It's almost impossible to have a meeting with some scholars. And this is something which one has to be very careful about, not to fall into this. Even if you're not a scholar, let's say you're a very successful businessman, make sure that at least this godly attribute you have, that Pharaoh had, that you can always, whoever wants to see you, the door is always open, so you can always have that. So, without a doubt then, Pharaoh, there was a two-sided character to him. On the inside, there was a form of destitution and humility. He did appreciate that. He did see his own destitution on the batin, on the inner aspect of himself. But on the outside, that which was expressed and reflected and manifested, he couldn't escape that. That love for power, worldly control, that was on the outside. So he was in battle with himself, and for most of his life, that outer aspect was victorious for most of his life. But maybe things were to change towards the end, or not. The command came to 2 prophets. Allah said, look, I want 2 prophets to go to him. And the command was to speak with him with gentleness. I'm going to stray a bit now and speak about other things, and we'll come back to this story, inshallah, tomorrow. This layyana, this gentleness, this has to be opened up a bit because it has a lot of socio-political ramifications too. And the principle, after I explain it to you, we may all agree. But when it comes to the particularities, that's where the disagreements usually arise. This gentleness, is it a form of mudahana, which means a negative form of compromise, which I'll explain in a minute? Or is this gentleness a form of coping with, a form of mudara? Which one is it? Is it a compromising in the negative sense, where you're compromising yourself, your ideals, your ideology, your beliefs? Or is it no, you're not compromising those, but for something, looking at the bigger picture of things, you're coping with a certain status quo for a period of time. Not that you're saying that my beliefs is something else or anything. What is this gentleness referring to? That That which is not allowed in Islam is when you encounter a person and this person, let's say, has a lot of worldly benefits, is very wealthy, affluent, or has other worldly benefits other than money and capital. And then you have X degree of greed and avarice towards those worldly benefits of that person. And as a result of that greed, you approve, albeit silently, of their vice and bad actions. Or you abandon, by being silent, denying that their bad actions are vice. But the reason you're doing either of these two is because the aspect of attraction and greed towards that person's power, and you want a share. Wanting a share, though, is relative here. Maybe 1% to maybe 99%. And so for your own self and worldly interests, you attract them to yourself by not going against their vice, or by abandoning, denying their vice. This much is wrong in Islam. That kind of a compromise, in Arabic it's mudahana. It's a kind of smoothness. Dough is oil. You're smoothing things, but why? Because of your greed, your own interests. I don't want to enter examples again, and we don't even have to go back in history, but our communities are drowned in this. I don't know what the solution is, I have to say with all humility, but something has to be done drastically before it reaches a point of no return. And everyone to themselves, you know yourself better, but this is a very big threat, this kind of compromise. Sometimes the compromise is done willingly, that's wrong. They do it with intention. Sometimes though it happens unwillingly, i.e. unintentionally rather. They had good intentions to start off with. It wasn't a case of greed or compromising beliefs and ideology, but it ended like that. And here, this is a very important discussion in the political sciences, or Islamic political sciences, that when you want to propagate a community, an ummah, do you start from bottom and work yourself upwards, or do you start from the top and work downwards? Do you start at the grassroots with the common lay people and grow, and when it reaches a level, then the time for governance arises? Or do you start with the presidents and the kings and the queens and try to fix them? And then if they're fixed, then it will go downwards, infiltrate and permeate through the masses. Previous Sharias, we see different courses of actions with different prophets. Some prophets, they started with the queen of the place, and then they worked downwards. Although we have to look into history why they chose that course of action. But that course of action which the Muhammadan law puts forward is to start at grassroots, and start with the common lay people. And when you succeed with the common lay people, when it reaches a certain level, then the start to establish a government or governance, only then when you get that popular support, then it becomes justified. Otherwise it won't be justified, albeit legitimate. In Iran, for example, there were people who would approach the Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, and maybe their aims were noble, I don't want to judge them, but they never succeeded. And actually their fate ended in a very negative way, with the compromise of their ideology. I'm not saying today, when you see people approach the presidents and governmental figures, it's wrong period. I don't want to give that image right now. But I'm saying that in Islam there's a protocol. The protocol starts with the grassroots level. Now, it doesn't mean you don't approach other influential people, but if you don't have the grassroots level, that's not going to work, most probably. And therefore, the bottoms-up approach is the approach which Islam puts forward rather than starting from the top. You start from the top, it's going to cause more vice. And actually, in America and in Europe, there are some examples of that, which has happened in the last 2 decades. So there are elements of truth in both approaches, but the main approach is to start with grassroots level. Anyway, that's the negative form of compromise, where there's an element of greed on the one side, and then you're attracting people through abandoning, denying their vice, or even approving of their vice because of your own interest. That no one accepts in Islam. And any form of gentleness in this line wouldn't be acceptable. However, there is a form of gentleness which in Arabic they say mudara. It's a form of coping, adapting to a certain status quo for a period of time. Now what's that? Here, the intention, the purpose of being gentle is to either prevent a vice happening or reduce a vice which is happening. You can't eliminate it, but you can reduce it. You cope with a certain status quo for a period of time. Or you lower the rate that a given vice is spreading in a community. If just by coping with a certain status quo, you can lower the rate of vice spreading, you cope. Here, with either of these three, either preventing a vice, reducing a vice, or lowering the rate at which this vice is propagating in a society, coping entails 2 elements. 1, you prevent yourself from denying the vice, because by doing so, it may lower a vice, reduce a vice, or the spread of it. But at the same time, you cope if, and this is the important part, if, and only if, it's not feasible to eliminate or prevent the vice in its entirety in the first place. If that is possible, that's the course of action, there's no doubt. But the reality is it's not possible. When it's not possible, you prevent yourself from denying that vice with this intention and purpose, that you will either reduce the vice, prevent it, or control its spread. That's coping. You're not compromising with your beliefs here. It's different to the first. There's no greed here. The goal is in working the best interest of the Ummah at this given time. Now, it may, in the long run, it may add to the virtue of the Ummah, it may decrease the Ummah's rise, that if you were to go out full front, when you can't eliminate it, but you go out full front, you may cause more damage. So with the peace treaty of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, with the Hudaybiyah treaty of the Holy Prophet, with what happened to Lady Fatima after Saqifa, and how Amir al-Mu'mineen acted, these things come into play sometimes. If it was feasible for it to be eliminated, of course they would do it. But once something is not feasible to be eliminated, who do you think you are to act against the best interest of the Ummah? And this gentleness, coping, is one application of taqiyyah. Now, taqiyyah in the fiqh sense you all know about. It's a much broader term though. And this taqiyyah, most people fail in not practicing it. Taqiyyah in the open sense. It's a much broader term, as I've just explained, all these examples of that. In the fiqh sense too, yes, it has a meaning, it's a much narrower meaning, but here it's much broader. Inna akramakum indallah, you people, the most dignifying amongst you before Allah, or who? Atqakum, which is commonly translated as those who have more taqwa. But taqwa and being dignified are concomitants to one another. It's like saying, wherever there's liquid, it's wet. Everyone knows that. When you say liquid, wetness automatically comes. Yeah. Concomitants, kalazum in Arabic. Or wherever there's an even number, it's divisible by 2. That's definite. And that's why the Urafo in this verse, it may also be translated as the more dignifying amongst you are those who have more taqwa. But there's something more subtle here, that atqakum is the plural of taqi, one who does taqiyyah. And then the more dignifying amongst you are those who do more taqiyyah in this broad sense. Why are they more dignifying? Because it's the best interest of Islam they see. Shiism wants to grow in certain environments. It's not a black and white issue. We're thinking of the best interest of Shias and Shiism and Islam to grow. It's not easy. It requires a lot of dignity. Inshallah, we'll continue with this tomorrow. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi.